Hi, I'm Sebastian Rotella. I'm the author of Rip Crew, and you're watching Author's Voice.
Hi everybody, and welcome to Author's Voice, where we're connecting authors to the world. This is Solved, and I am Libby Hellman, your host, also the author of 15 compulsively readable thrillers. Today we're going to be talking to Sebastian Rotella, whose third book, Rip Crew, has just come out, or it came out in March, and it's fabulous. And I can't wait for you to meet him and talk with me through him. Oh no, I got that wrong. Talk through me with him about the book and some of the issues that it raises. And in fact, if you are watching on Facebook Live, please use the comments to submit a question. We'd love to hear from you. And if you just include your first name and where you're from, we'll get a sense of, more of a sense of you. So don't be shy. We love questions. Most importantly though, you can order a signed book of Rip Crew right now, right here. All you have to do is go to authorsvoice.net and get your copy. Just follow the directions. It's very simple. Even I can do it. So let's get going. Sebastian Rotella has a really interesting background. Oh, by the way, the book is published by Mulholland, which is a division of Little Brown. So we want to thank Mulholland for making the books and Sebastian available this afternoon. Okay, here goes. This is an amazing bio. Sebastian Rotella is the author of The Convert Song and Triple Crossing, which the New York Times Book Review named as its favorite debut crime novel of 2011, as well as the nonfiction book Twilight on the Line. He's a senior reporter covering international security issues for ProPublica, a newsroom dedicated to investigative journalism in the public interest. He worked for 23 years for the LA Times, Los Angeles Times, serving as bureau chief in Paris and Buenos Aires. His honors include a Peabody Award for Finding Oscar in connection with PBS's Frontline, Columbia University's DART Award, and Moore's Cabot Prize for Latin American coverage. The German Marshall Fund's Weitz Prize for reporting in Europe, 5 Overseas Press Club Awards, the Urbino Prize of Italy, and an Emmy nomination. He was a Pulitzer finalist for international reporting in 2006. And that's just a little bit of his bio. If I went on, we'd be here the whole time. But anyway, Rip Crew is his third novel. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. I'm glad we could make this work. Why did you gravitate toward journalism in the first place? What was it? You talk about the forces of crime and corruption. What was your first beat, and how did that all happen?
I gravitated toward journalism, I guess, because it combined the world of ideas and the world of the street. You know, and I grew up on the south side of Chicago in an academic family, so I was always very drawn to academia and writing and reading and fiction and literature and politics. But there was something about journalism and that idea of being able to get out there on the street and explore secret worlds and the adrenaline of it and the challenge of it and thinking on your feet that appealed to me.
How old were you when you decided, or when this came to you, that you knew this was going to be what you did?
You know, it's funny. I mean, it feels like the idea that I was going to write was always there. And I was like the columnist of my high school newspaper and things like that. In college, I studied English literature and studied with a couple of fiction writers, the great Jim Shepard, who's a great short story and writer and novelist. And I almost did the Master of Fine Arts, route that so many writers do, where you go and learn to do a couple of years, get your master's, and teach and write novels. But part of me was like, what am I going to write about? What experiences have I had? And I was very interested in journalism, and particularly in being a foreign correspondent, because I'm the son of immigrants, and I'd always had traveled a lot, and so there was that dream of being a foreign correspondent in particular.
What was your first job in journalism?
My first job in journalism was as the classic Chicago newspaper job. I was a editorial assistant, or better known, copy boy at the Chicago Sun-Times.
No kidding.
That's right, in 1984.
My first broadcast job was as a copy girl at KYW in Philadelphia, the all news radio station.
So we started out right.
In the same place, so to speak. You mentioned Chicago, and I'm really glad that you're from Chicago, and welcome back, because we are broadcasting from Chicago. But did that inform your profession or your choice of becoming a journalist at all? Or?
I think it really did, because there's such a great newspaper tradition in this town, and I grew up like all the rest of us reading Mike Royko and reading these newspapers that were, the work was a product of these great classic newspaper wars and the Chicago newspaper tradition. And again, Chicago has such a wonderful and interesting mix of cultures, where the literature, architecture, classical music, jazz, blues. But it also has these underworlds, of politics and crime and corruption and organized crime, and as I grew up, I was interested in both, and I think that really formed my outlook and prepared me for some of the kind of work I've done around the world.
Interesting. Why did you make the jump from reporting to fiction, or how did that come about? Well, you kind of alluded to it just now, but.
Yeah, I think I've had the good fortune to cover a lot of fascinating beats and interesting stories. I started particularly at the Mexican border, which was my first big job at the Los Angeles Times. I covered the Mexican border for 5 years during a very intense period of the sort of drug wars, the sort of the explosion of the immigration debate in the United States and all that. So I had a lot of stored up experience and emotion and images from that period that I wrote a nonfiction book first in 1998, but I had this desire to write a novel, and at a certain point, there's a compulsion, right? You feel like you need to tell these stories again, or at least use all that material and that knowledge and that experience to tell stories about the greater truths.
And now you know issues. when you were asking yourself when you were younger, what were you going to write about? Now you know.
Right. No, there was no shortage of things to write about. There was, putting it together was the challenge, but there was a lot. I certainly have, as a foreign correspondent there in Latin America and in Europe, I really have learned a lot and acquired a lot of material, so to speak.
So tell us what the title of Rip Crew means.
Rip Crews are gangs that function at the Mexican border on both sides that dedicate themselves to robbing other criminals, to robbing smugglers. So they rip off smugglers of drugs, they take the drugs, they're very violent by nature, you can imagine if they're criminals taking on other criminals. And what happens in this book is they also prey on immigrant smugglers and literally attack them, kidnap the migrants, and hold them for ransom. So they take the human cargo and hold them for ransom. So they're called. So Rip Crew refers to the idea that they're rip-offs.
Yeah. I keep thinking of the word barnacle, but what I'm thinking, something that leaches onto something else.
I think they're both predators and parasites.
Parasite.
Right.
That was the word I was looking
it's
for.
It's parasitical, but it's definitely predatory too.
Yeah.
And so it's I'd gotten to know a lot of people covering the border and covering migration, a lot of sources in law enforcement and intelligence and in that world, who told me about, during a trip a few years ago to the southern border of Mexico, the border of Mexico and Guatemala, who told me a lot about how dangerous, they were always dangerous, but ever more desperate and dangerous the journeys of the migrants have become that come up, most of them from Central America or other countries, through Mexico and the different groups that prey on them, whether street gangs or cartels or these Rip Crews.
So
and I thought that was a fascinating topic.
It's not just the coyotes, it's more organized.
It's a mix. There's the coyotes who have to sort of pay taxes or do the bidding of the cartels, which have increasingly muscled into this business. But increasingly it is a business which is, because it's so lucrative and because it's so hard for people to cross on their own, that it's, it's controlled by these criminal underworlds. And particularly the Central American street gangs really prey on, because so many of these people are Central American now who are the migrants. So the Maras, Mara Salvatrucha, some of these, which have become these transnational criminal organizations.
This is more, it seems like I have not heard of Rip Crews before I read your book, and I'm wondering, is it more of a local or regional issue, or is it pretty well known and I just haven't been aware? Listening.
It's pretty well known to me because I've been covering it for so long. I think every once in a while it's one of these things that the border just, even though it gets talked about all the time in the political discourse, the details of what really goes on doesn't get that much attention. There was one case where a Border Patrol agent, I believe in 2010, 2012 timeframe, was killed by a Rip Crew in Arizona, and that's when they got some they got some attention. So every once in a while there'll be something that happens that's dramatic enough, or there'll be cases, where in Phoenix a house full of migrants will be found, people being held prisoner, and that's the result of a RIP crew kidnapping. But so it's gotten into the media now and then, but it doesn't get the kind of attention sort of away from the border that you would think.
Yeah. Okay. Your story has to do with a group of African women who were brought into Mexico to come into the United States. Tell me, I had no idea that African sex traffickers were being enslaved. And tell me about this. How prevalent is it? When did it start? Why did it start?
I mean, certainly it's not really sex trafficking, it's trafficking of migrants, many of whom are women. But it's something that's been going on. Eritrea has, because it's under a lot of crisis, it's become a very repressive regime. So there's a lot of migration from Eritrea. Some of it goes to Europe, particularly through the sea route through Italy, which I also write about the book. And some of it comes through this incredibly circuitous route. I met a woman, an Eritrean woman, in a Mexican detention center in southern Mexico, who was one of the seeds of the story. She was there with her son, who was about 3, and he was stateless. He didn't have a passport because he'd been born during this journey, which had led her from Eritrea, Sudan, South Africa, Brazil, and she had made it as far as the southern border. She was bound for Chicago.
Oh,
and she had, at that point in her journey, which had gone on 4 years, during which she'd had this boy. So that's just one of these odysseys. And so you have Eritreans, Somalis, and Ethiopians are one of the biggest groups. There was a period where these East Africans were one of the biggest groups being caught.
Who captures them? Who's capturing them and taking them, and how are they getting them to Mexico?
In other words, they aren't captured; they are smuggled or trafficked. So you have these. They're both clients and victims, right? So you have these international smuggling syndicates that move them, right? But what happens is
these are desperate women.
These are desperate women and men. Sometimes it's both, and there's also people from India, people from China. There's all these different groups. There's Nepalese. There's Cubans. The variety of people is fascinating, and they all pay a lot of money, which is why they're much more lucrative than, say, Mexicans or Central Americans. And what happens is the line between being a client and a victim is blurry, right? People end up being held, oh no, we want more money. Or what happens in the book happens, they get the smugglers, a RIP crew comes in or other smugglers and take the load, and then hold them for ransom. So it's a desperate and incredibly dangerous odyssey.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about Valentine Pescadora and Mendez. Why did you decide? I know Valentine is your numero uno guy, right? He's your protagonist in all 3 novels. Is Mendez in the other 2
He's
novels?
He's in the first one.
Okay.
The first book, Triple Crossing, has the same structure as this one in that it alternates between Mendez and Pescatore.
Okay, so tell us about how did you pronounce it?
Pescatore.
Oh, you do it so much nicer. Sorry, I can't pronounce it. Where did he come from?
Pescatore he's from Chicago originally, not surprisingly, but he's a young, in the first book, he's a young Border Patrol agent, a kid, a street kid who's kind of walking the line between cop and criminal. He's joined the U.S. Border Patrol, and he's kind of wild, and he's he's a good man, but he's got an attraction to outlaws and the dark side, and he finds himself in that world at the border, which is so corrupt and so full of ambiguities and violence and tension. In the first book, he finds himself being pulled across the line and gets recruited to be an undercover informant and infiltrates a cartel, and that's sort of his odyssey in that book. In the second book, he moves to Argentina, becomes a private investigator because he's of Argentine and Mexican-American descent, right? So in the second book, he becomes a private investigator and based overseas, and in this one, he's back in the U.S. and he gets recruited to work for Homeland Security. So, so he's a little older, a little wiser, a little calmer, but he's still a pretty volatile character.
Let's talk about Mendez, and then we have a question from someone in the audience. Sure. Where Mendez used to be a cop, but now he is a reporter.
He has a complicated job description.
Yeah, it's really complicated.
Which is, by the way, I have to tell you, much more realistic than you would expect in Latin America. Because you have to think that in Mexico and the rest of Latin America, with all the corruption in law enforcement, there's been a desperate attempt to recruit people to clean up the police. And often I've met people just like Mendez. academics, military people, people from intelligence, and a couple of journalists. And journalists in Latin America do a lot of investigating. Often they do the work that the police and prosecutors should be doing and don't because they're scared or corrupt. So Mendez starts out as a reporter and a human rights activist, and finds himself chosen to head an anti-corruption unit in Tijuana. And in this book, he's left that job and gone back to being a journalist, but he's really torn between being a cop and journalist.
Yeah, that comes out. Now, they know each other, obviously, and they end up working together to solve this or bring the people to justice who killed all of these African women. Why did you decide to put them both into the story as sort of co-protagonists rather than just having one?
It's a very good question. I really liked in the first book, especially because they were from different sides of the border, alternating between those two stories and seeing that reality from the different perspectives. And in this one, I sort of played on that. Now they're more allies. In the first book, they were they were antagonists.
Oh, really?
They became allies, but it's a convoluted story. But it was also interesting to me because triple crossing.
Right.
But so in this one, Pescatore is based in the U.S., but he goes down into Mexico and other places to investigate. And Mendez has had to leave Tijuana. He's a Mexican journalist. Because of death threats, he's living in exile in San Diego, so he's kind of a fish out of water. And they sort of team up, but he's actually investigating. He's reporting in the U.S. So the idea was kind of to move them around on the geographical chessboard and have them team up. And I think that kind of fiction, I enjoy, and reading it, and I enjoy writing it, where you have different perspectives on the same reality, and in this case, they end up actually teaming up. So, and in that sense, there's a number of other characters from the previous book, and in that, it was like a reunion of old friends, to bring those characters back together.
That's fun. That's nice. And you already know them, and hopefully the reader gets a sense of your fondness for them through the way you portray them. We do have a question from Mike, who is in Oklahoma City. Hi, Mike. What inspired you to write mysteries in the first place? What do you love about reading those kinds of stories? And what did you read? What kinds
It's a great question. I think I started out like a lot of people reading Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett, the classic private eye writers, American private eye writers. I always liked international thrillers like Frederick Forsyth and things like that. And as I got older, John le Carré and Eric Ambler, the British espionage writer, someone I liked.
Gotta put her in there. She was the only woman around
Absolutely.
at that time.
Patricia Highsmith is another great author, and more in the suspense arena. But Patricia Highsmith often has expatriates, as protagonists. So I always liked that, again, because I have this mix of, I'm of Italian and Spanish descent and the son of immigrants and have traveled a lot and all that. So I always liked those kinds of stories. But in general, I think the thriller, mystery, crime genre at its best, does sort of the job of popular entertainment, tells you an entertaining story, but it's a way of exploring these underworlds that I think you learn a lot about the way the world works through that perspective. And I think that's a great literary tradition. I've always liked it. And it's also because so much of my work as a journalist has been covering law enforcement and intelligence, organized crime, terrorism. That's really the world I know well, and so I think that's what I'm best. I mean, there's a lot of things I could write, but that's certainly an arena which I feel very comfortable in.
I may be jaded because I write thrillers also, but I'm used to people who pretend to be good, but they're really evil. And I kept looking for Mayo or the secretary, these are two characters in his book, to double-cross Mendez and Valentine. But did you consider having that happen? I mean,
it's a good question. I mean, I think the secretary, I don't know if he double crosses him, but you do get the sense the secretary is he's a character also from the first book, by the way, in which he has already double crossed Mendez once, if you read the first book. But he is certainly an ambiguous, slippery character where the whole time you feel like, yes, he's giving him a tip and putting him on the trail of an important story, but you always feel that he is managing the information as befits him, and the reason why he's doing it, if you remember, he presented to Mendez, he says, here's a story you can do that'll really, prevent these bad guys from getting out of prison.
Immediately made my hackles go up.
Right,
and I said, okay,
right. So I think
he's
a slippery character, a man of power, who's and a spinner of spider webs who's trying to manipulate him. So in that sense, I think he has that treacherous side. Mayo to me is much more a classic kindred spirit of Mendez, because there's a lot of parallels. He's a Sicilian.
He was too nice, he was like almost too nice too soon. And I kept waiting for this other shoe to drop.
That's
But it
fair.
didn't.
That's fair. But I think what happens with Mayo is he's more, and I think this is based on real life. People who have done that kind of work, say the Italian cops and prosecutors I've known who have investigated the mafia in Sicily, particularly in the 90s when they were at their peak and prosecutors were getting killed. They make connections with people who have done the same thing in other places like Latin America. So if you think about those two characters, they both live what in Italian is called la vita blindata, and in Spanish la vida blindada, but it means the same thing. It's the armored life. To be surrounded by enemies and treachery as a prosecutor or a cop, live with bodyguards constantly and fighting these incredibly powerful, dangerous forces. So to me, the idea was that was almost these were members of a brotherhood, and when they found each other, it would make sense that they would team up and work with each other.
So that brings up two other questions I had. I know very little about Mexican politics and the cartels and corruption, but it always seems like fighting these forces are like David versus Goliath, with the good guys as David. Can you persuade me otherwise? Are there enough good guys who are fighting the cartels?
I'm not going to persuade you that it's not a dangerous, lopsided battle, because it really is. And unfortunately, things are getting worse rather than better. As you know, Mexico is one of the most dangerous places to be a journalist, for example. And I just last year, a Mexican journalist I knew, Javier Valdez Cardenas, who worked in Sinaloa, which is the epicenter of a lot of the cartels, was killed for what he wrote. And there are brave cops and honest prosecutors, but the structure is so dangerous. Both at sort of the street level, the cartels, the power of the cartels is so overwhelming, they've almost become a parallel state. Yeah. To the point that they do things like the cartels send people out on patrol to patrol areas like they were a sinister police. The cartels have their own roadblocks, where you pull up to a roadblock and you don't know if these guys, paramilitary guys, are real cops, corrupt cops, narcos pretending to be cops. So it is dangerous at the street level, but I think the profound problem in Mexico is that there is this infrastructure of impunity that exists. All we talk about is the cartels and the drug lords. The problem in Mexico is that there are people in high positions of power who I covered when I was a young reporter 25 years ago, for their alleged drug connections, against whom there seem to be very strong cases, and they remain in those positions of power. And I think Mexico will begin to change, the way Colombia did, by the way. Colombia is a hopeful example. When you're talking about arresting not just corrupt cops and drug lords, but bankers and politicians. That's the bottom line. There is a structure of impunity that protects bona fide criminals, but also protects people who are getting away with massive corruption.
What you've been describing in Mexico sounds awfully like what's going on in Russia, where the corrupt organizations have basically taken over the government.
I think that's right. It's funny because I've covered Latin America much more extensively and for many more years, but I have been covering Russia in the past couple of years, and the model of Russia is very similar, the idea, particularly to places, I would say, Mexico is one example. Another would be Argentina, because you think about Argentina, where there was a military dictatorship, then it returned to democracy, but the power of the intelligence services and the military, which were very corrupt, they became the mafias. Russia's a bit like that, but in Russia you have this fusion of organized crime, intelligence services, oligarchs, and politics.
With so much corruption in so many places, including our own government, how do you measure success? I mean, you break news, maybe there's a humiliation of someone, maybe law enforcement acts, but a month later, it happens all over again someplace else. How do you keep going?
It's funny you asked that question because in one of my books, I won't say which one, but when the bad guy gets brought down at the end, one of my characters says to another, it's really too late because the fact that he got caught means that he's no longer powerful, otherwise he wouldn't have gotten caught. And the other one character says, well, that sucks. Why do we even bother chasing them, right? But I think, look, number one, as I said, Colombia is a perfect example, where they took on the cartels, they took on the FARC, they took on the forces within the state that were accomplices of these dangerous figures. And what they did, not only did they lock those people up, but they made the country safer for everyone, right? Crime went down, kidnapping went down, murder went down. So I think it can be done. But, you measure success, with small victories, and you can't. I think the people who do it in a place like, say, Brazil now, where there's like really like an earthquake of investigations of corruption. They can't worry about what political impact this is going to have. They have to worry about, I'm going to build this case, and they can't worry about, oh, it's futile because if I take down this guy, others will replace him. That you have to focus on the specific cases. I think what other countries have done, like Guatemala is an example, where they try to also build up their institutions. So I think what Latin America everywhere needs is strengthening the police, professionalizing the justice system.
How do you cleanse your soul from being around so much corruption and crime and writing about it and investigating it?
Now that's a good question. I think, partly writing the books, frankly, writing the fiction, because I think I tell these stories in journalism, and I try in journalism, and particularly at ProPublica, and to some extent at the LA Times, I was given a chance to write in a literary way and tell, in-depth stories and spend time in the reporting and bring out the characters and all that. But in the fiction, you have much more liberty and authority, and even though I try to be very rigorous and authentic, I still have, I can weave these tales and give a sense of what those worlds are really like, and give a sense of, the emotions and the individuals and the characters and the voices. And part of it is when I write about some of these stories, I write about them because they were things that really struck me. Like Mendez is based on people I knew or know, some of whom died, and so part of telling stories about a guy like Mendez allows me to revisit and think about and reflect on and evoke, those stories. And the book is partly a tribute to people like him, people I've known.
Since we're talking about fiction, talk about the transition from writing nonfiction to fiction. What was the easiest part? What was the hardest part for you?
It's true that it's both easy and hard. I mean, obviously being a journalist is important and helps you because you learn to tell a story, you learn to observe a lot very quickly. There's an Italian writer, Leonardo Sciascia, a novelist, who talks about a cop at a crime scene trying to soak everything up, and he's sort of catching things in his net, that he's going to be, because he has to write his report, and he's like, oh God, am I going to get all this right, and am I going to remember everything? So that training as a journalist is great, and the ability to not just gather the material, but organize stories and be rigorous about the presentation and the facts and the details. On the other hand, the voice, you have to change your voice, as you know, right? And you want the language to be elegant and beautiful, and you have to sort of stamp some of that newspaper speak out of, that newspaper speak which is necessary because you have to be careful when you're writing, when you're writing nonfiction, so to speak, that you're hewing to the sources and the facts. So that part of the process is liberating, but it also, it takes you a while to shift voices.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Did you take liberties with your characters? I mean, I know we haven't talked at all about Isabel. She was another one I wasn't sure of. I really wasn't sure. You did that. You handled her very well. Now, I didn't have the benefit of reading the first two books, so I didn't know that, I knew that she and
there was a backstory.
Yeah, there was a huge backstory. But I thought maybe she was going to turn on him or something. Talk a little bit about, did you take any liberties with her and who she is and what she does?
Well, I mean, she is certainly based, again, as is the French, there's another character in another book who's a French police woman, police commander.
Yeah, let me just interrupt and say, this is really the coolest thing. Valentine starts the book thinking he's been dumped by two women, and the book ends with Valentine realizing that he's still got these two women who are interested in him. I thought that was
and realizing how lucky he is.
Yeah.
But no, I think she is inspired, again, by women I've known both of them are by women I've known in law enforcement and intelligence and that kind of thing, who, it's a particularly difficult world for women, obviously, and I think there's a combination of strength and vulnerability, and in her position, she's also risen high in the U.S. government at a young age, as a woman, as a Latina and all that, so she's taking a lot of forces, and there's that play between ambition and loyalty to him. And I think part of when you put your finger on something that's true in the book is that as things go along, he's feeling more and more paranoid and solitary and not knowing whom he can trust, which is what those worlds do, right? When you are in worlds of lawlessness and corruption, it gets to a point where you don't know who to trust.
It's
right?
also a fine way to build suspense.
Absolutely.
Which you absolutely did. I mean, once the story really got rolling, I read it all. I mean, I just kind of glommed it all in.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, yeah. So here's a question. It's more of a philosophical question. You've probably read all the King's Men, right? by Robert Penn Warren.
Oh, yes,
with Willie,
of course.
Yeah, yeah.
Wonderful. One of the best
So,
written books
yeah.
in American
So
literature.
at the beginning, Willie Stark really is idealistic. He might be a populist, but he really does want the best for the people of Louisiana. He's corrupted by power, which is mostly how it happens. Is this endemic? Is this part of the system of being in a democratic society, that good people are corrupted and end up doing bad things?
I mean, I think it is, in the sense that politicians, the best politicians, you know, and we're sitting here surrounded by the aura of Abraham Lincoln, you know, I mean, I think have been able to combine their self-interest with the good politicians, you know, and not just being good at politics, but who are good men or good women, combine their political careers with doing good for others, right? And as you say, sometimes, particularly in societies where the rule of law is feeble or weak, like Willie Stark's Louisiana in that era, or certainly in Latin America, some of these, you know, because of what it takes to be in power, it almost pushes you into that kind of corruption. Because the institutions are weak, it's all about the force of the individual.
Because of compromise?
Right.
Because
So
of the compromises you have to make?
the compromise you have to make, what it entails, I mean, I think a specific example would be President Fujimori of Peru, who's somebody I covered and spent time around, who was elected democratically, but definitely had like kind of this sinister spy master who was helping him run the country. But the people, especially, you know, working class and poor people, said this guy defeated Sendero Luminoso, the terrorist group. Our lives got better under him. And his view of power was he would, and I went with him, he would fly into these godforsaken villages that had never seen a leader from Lima before, and he'd bring them, you know, an infrastructure or a highway or, you know, a sewer system, and say, this is democracy in action. I, the president, have brought you this, right? Mm-hmm. And he had. But that's not the way it's supposed to work, right? It's not this pact between you and the individual. But right. Sadly, I think that's what accumulating and building and hanging on to power requires, is instincts that go against, you know, some of the things that we associate with a truly functioning democracy.
When we talk about history or current events, actually, I mean, I find we're talking about patterns or themes that repeat themselves in different countries and different times. Do you feel that way in your work? That when you're covering or when you're writing fiction, I've been here before, I know how this works, I know how this is going to turn out?
I think so. I mean, I think that certainly having covered enough of these themes over a period of time, you start to, you know, like you were talking about the Russian comparison. When I started covering Russian issues and comparing it to Latin America, I was like, okay, I have a sense. You know, I really understand these mechanisms now, and it's different. And I'm not going to say it's not exactly the same, but it was almost like coming from Chicago. Frankly, when I got to Tijuana, the idea that the cops were working for the mafia didn't, you know, stun me, right? I mean, right. Or that judges were corrupt, right? I mean, so that's that kind of thing. Right. There are things that are new to me. I mean, for example, one of the things I do in this book, because I have covered foreign bad guys for so long, and written about them both in fiction and as a journalist in Rip Crew, one of the points of the book is that in the United States we have our own forms of corruption, particularly in the financial sector. You know, and we talk about these mafias and the drug cartels and the foreign bad guys. Well, we have, as you know, banks that have laundered huge amounts of money for drug cartels. We have real estate empires built on very dubious fortunes, right?
Oh, really?
Yeah, you know, I won't name any specifically. We have a decline. ProPublica has done some very good work on this, one of my colleagues, a precipitous decline in prosecutions of executives and white-collar crime by the Justice Department in the past 15 years. We had a financial crisis in 2008 where no one important really went to jail. So that was something new for me in this book that I explored. You know, and as much as it's an international thriller that moves around the world, one of the points of the book is that I wanted people to think about the concept of mafias and the so-called legitimate economy right here in the United States, not in Russia or Mexico.
Yeah, I had a question in here, but of course we're running out of time, about just that, about that your book was really very timely in some of the things you said. There's one other question, two other questions I want to ask you. There's a passage in the book that talks about the danger of investigating, where friends of the reporter tells him not to go there, that it's dangerous. And how often do you listen to your friends, and has your career ever gotten you into trouble?
Well, certainly when I was covering places like Tijuana, I mean, there's different things. I mean, if you're in a place like Iraq, where I've done assignments, and there's actual, combat or terrorist groups out there marauding, there is physical danger. But the kind of danger that he talks about, which journalists encounter all the time in places like Latin America or Russia, is investigating these forces of corruption, which are more sinister, more complicated. I always felt somewhat as an American journalist that it was safer, and it was, because I didn't live there. And you get the feeling that as an American journalist, American journalists, if somebody does something to do them, the chances of having some kind of repercussions are stronger. On the other hand, certainly when I was covering Tijuana, and I had sources like the police chief of Tijuana or a young prosecutor who got killed, I went to see them, and 2 days later I got the phone call they got killed. That has an impact on you. And there were certain people I was covering and I was particularly worried about the mid-level guys, not unlike the head of the RIP crew in my book. People who aren't just the grunts, so a grunt is only going to do a killing like that if he gets an order. Right. And the boss probably is going to think about it and say, is this going to be good for business? But the mid-level gunmen, who often rise and decide to become the boss because they're doing all the work. There was one group of gangsters, actually from San Diego, who were working for the Tijuana cartel, who I had written about, who people were telling me, now these guys you want to be careful of because they speak English, they move back and forth, they read the LA Times. And sure enough, they tried to kill, a group of them tried to, badly wounded an editor of a paper in Tijuana because he'd written about them, which is actually inspires one of the incidents in this book. If you think about the book, you'll probably know which one I'm talking about.
Have you read Don Winslow?
Yes.
His cartel book. There's some similarities in the tone.
He knows that world.
Yes. Well, you obviously do too. What are you working on now? What's number 4 going to be?
It's funny. I went back and forth, and I love Pescatore, and I love this series, and I'm definitely going to consider it. I mean, he's almost like a younger brother or a son, especially because he started out young. But I did decide to after the third one, to take a break. So I'm doing a new novel, which is a standalone character, an older character, more experienced, because Pescatore is kind of a character who kind of gets swept up in things, like in Eric Ambler type novels, where the person who is kind of in over their head and having to improvise.
Ordinary person in extraordinary
Exactly.
circumstances.
And this is going to be more a veteran investigator dealing with another set of challenges, but with more power, more control, and more in the world of anti-terrorism.
Okay.
So it's just going to
good.
be, you want to challenge yourself, right?
Absolutely, with every book. Unfortunately, we are way over, out of town. Out of town too. I don't know why I'm saying that, sorry about that. We've been talking about Rip Crew from Mulholland Books with Sebastian Rotella, and it's published by Little Brown, and it's $27, and you can order it right here on authorsvoice.net. All you have to do is go to the website, or if you're watching on Facebook Live, just click to the Facebook page, and then you can get to the website and order the book. And so I want to thank you very much for being here. Before we close, though, I just want to give you a heads up on what's coming. Stranger Than Fiction, Dan Weinberg will speak with author Craig Simons about World War II at Sea. That's at May 5th at noon. Berta's book, Roberta Rubin, interviews Julia Claiborne Johnson about her new novel, To Be Frank With Me, on Thursday, May 10th at 3:30 p.m. And on Solved, we'll be back again on March 17th to talk to Brian Freeman about his latest thriller, Alter Ego. Ask a question, order a book. You can still order a book way past the broadcast. And thank you all very much for being with us today.